Hi, Tracey here, and welcome to our video class for the first project for our second set this year. And we're going to be making our trim bin. Well, I call it a trim bin, but it would make a lovely gift for somebody. You could put a lovely cup and fill it with chocolates or whatever, or you could use it in your bathroom and have brushes and things in. Or what a lovely idea to give a gift with a plant. So it's a dual purpose gift. You could use the plant and you could use the basket for whatever you choose. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about the preparation of what I need to do to prepare for this project. So in your instructions, as part of your instructions, you will get a pattern, the circular pattern, which is the base pattern for the bin. And I trace it off onto tracing paper. On your pattern, you will have a horizontal and vertical centre lines, and do mark those because it actually makes it easier for positioning your base centre design. I always print off my templates. So there are two designs that create the whole piece. So I've printed the two and I've stuck them together so that I know where each design fits on my project. I have my fabrics cut as per the instructions, and I've also got my heat and bond light attached to the back, and I've removed the backing paper. I have my pins, I have my marking pencils, everything is ready. So the next thing we need to do is get our fabric prepared for our main piece of fabric. So on the back, I have fused a piece of bag wadding. Now this is a stiffer than normal fusible batting, and that's what gives the body to our piece of fabric, and that's what enables it to hold its shape. So I've fused that to the back. I have ruled a vertical centre line through the full length of the piece of fabric. Now with my template, I need to mark on this piece of fabric. So I have two cross lines down on this centre piece of fabric. The first one is 7 inches from the end, and the second one is 19 3/8. Now they are the centre points for our two embroidery designs. So we're going to start with our number one design, and on our template, the shorter of the two designs is number one, and the longer one is number two. Now those design numbers are in your instructions, so you can correspond the design number with the actual template. So what we need to do now is attach our fabric to our hoop. So in my hoop, I have 2 layers of a cutaway stabiliser, and I've also marked my vertical and horizontal centre markings. Now those markings are not centre of the hoop, they're centre of the design area. And you can see how these notches here are not halfway, but they are the markings that we need to use. So I have my vertical and horizontal, and now I'm going to use my curved pins, and with my number one design, I'm going to pin it to my hoop. So I need to align my lines with my little notches and make sure that they are in place. Now when I'm using these pins, I do use curved pins because it's easy to put them through everything. And I'm putting them in a way so it's easy for me to remove when I'm basting. Because this design takes up almost the whole hoop, you will have to remove the pins as you're going. So for the sides, I'm just making sure that my lines are okay. Now I will still check this with my precise positioning in my machine. But now we have that in place, and we'll go to the machine. So we'll take this over to the machine. So I'm at my machine now, and I have my hoop attached. I've used my precise positioning and checked that the center point is the center of the design. I've also checked that my fabric is actually vertically and horizontally accurate. So now I've got my basting stitch on and we're set to embroider. So now we have our design in our machine. We have our fabric basted in position on our hoop. I've removed all the pins, and the first part of our design is the applique. So as you can see on the design here, we have positioning stitches. Now before we start that, because we have such dense batting on the back of our fabric, I have dropped my tension so that it is a little bit lower to compensate for the density of this. So our first colour is our positioning stitches, and we will go with that. So one thing I have to emphasize, when you're starting, make sure your design is in the right direction so that the top of the fabric is along that edge that is straight, and this bottom edge down here is halfway through the fabric. It's really important to make sure that your designs are facing the correct direction. So we have both of our applique pieces on. Now you might wonder why I use two pieces of fabric rather than one. The reason I do that is so that it is actually easier to cut them out. Now just a little tip, when I'm cutting on the outside edge, I actually work clockwise. So I always start at the base with the bottom edge of my scissors, and I've got these little Kai scissors and they have a lovely little curve edge on them. They are Kai 5100 and they are my favourite of all applique little scissors. So I work going clockwise as close as possible to my edges without cutting them. Now here in the middle we have to cut this centerpiece out. So when I'm cutting something from the inside, I actually work anti-clockwise and just use the point to pick up a little bit of the fabric and work again as close as possible to those stitches without cutting them. And I find if I work that way, you can see how close I can get to the stitches. So clockwise to remove the outer and anti-clockwise to remove the inner. And what we need to do now is trim away all the excess from around our daisy petals on both of our applique pieces. So we now have our applique trimmed and ready for the next stitch. And our next stitch is actually the appliquing the centerpiece. So we need to place just the corner of our fabric over in position and stitch our next lot of stitches. Now we have our centers stitched down and trimmed back as well. We're ready to start the gold work in the machine. So the next step is the gold work, the cross hatching on our centers. So I've got my gold thread in the machine and we're ready to go. So the first design is finished. Now it's time to do the second one. So I'll undo the basting stitch, rehoop with the 2 layers of cutaway, and then I'll check in the machine that my design is right way up, and by that I mean this time the open area is at the top and the straight at the bottom. So I've hooped my second piece of 2 layers of stabiliser, and now I'm starting on my second design. Again, make sure that the design is the correct way up, and as before we do our positioning stitch and place our fabric and do our zigzag applique stitch for our first and our second applique of the daisies. So now we have trimmed off the applique for both the flowers and the centre. It's time to do our gold work and then finish up with the satin stitch as we did with the first design. So our embroidered panel is now complete. So the next step is to trim it up and start putting the bin together. Now I've completed the embroidery for the main body of our trim bin, and I've trimmed the top edge 3/8 of an inch, but all other seam allowances are 1/2 an inch. And I do the top edge 3/8 of an inch because that's the edge that we're binding. I've pressed that, removed all my lines, and I'm ready for the final embroidery. So I have my fabric marked vertically and horizontally centered, pinned to my hoop, and now I'm ready for that part of the embroidery. Our trim bin outer surface is complete now, so you can see that we've got all that embroidery done. We've unpicked the basting and it's all been trimmed back to the required measurements. So what we need to do now is the embroidery on the base of our bin. So I have my fabric cut to the size required. I've got my horizontal and vertical center lines on, and it has been positioned in the hoop so that the center of the design matches exactly that center point. So I have my design all set to go. I need to add my basting stitch around the design. So I'm going to add my basting and it will take me to where I need to be. Now, when I'm doing my basting, you can see my pins are very close. So if you have the ability to use your foot control pedal rather than your stop-start button, I recommend that you do this and use your foot control so that you're in charge of the speed and how close you get to your pins. If you don't have this function, you will need to take the pins out as you go and very carefully hold your fabric. Now, once the basting is complete, remove all your pins. And what we need to do now is place our piece of applique fabric over the top. So this time, because our floral fabric is the main fabric, I need to put my piece of spotty fabric over, and I'm going to match those drawn lines. So you can see my vertical lines are matching and my horizontal lines are now matching. And our first stitch is the border outline for our applique. So I'll just carefully hold that in place. And I'll trim my stitch. Now, as you can see, I've used the matching thread for the applique fabric. So whichever colour you choose to do your applique, make sure you have your matching thread. So as we did with the other appliques, I'm trimming them back as close as possible to my stitches without actually cutting them. And after that, I'll complete the embroidery as per the design layout. So trim back and complete as per the design instructions. Once the applique for the flower petals has been trimmed, we place the centerpiece over and do that applique as well. Now we have the gold work that goes over the center design and also for the circles around this center design. For our bin base is complete. Now we have to cut the circular design, and I've traced the pattern onto tracing paper and marked the horizontal and vertical center lines. And what I'm going to do now is align the center vertical and horizontal markings and pin in place and trim around the edge. So all our embroideries are finished now, and I've cut my base to the pattern, and we have our main part trimmed. Now remember, we have a 1/2 inch on the bottom edge and 3/8 on the top. Now on the wrong side, I have ruled my 1/2 inch seam allowance along the base and the two sides, but not the top edge. And I've also done my 1/2 inch, I've drawn my 1/2 inch around here as well. And the reason for doing that is I'm going to trim the bulk of the batting and the lining away. Now that is our seam allowance, so we don't want the bulk of all of this in the seam allowance. So we need to peel this back first of all from our main piece of fabric. So just gently pull this back on those three sides. We're leaving it on the top edge so it gives a little bit of body to when we put our binding on. So I will peel these edges back. And then carefully trim these on the line that I've drawn, so that we don't have the bulk in our seams. And I draw the line just to make it a little bit easier so we know we're getting it straight. Just be careful not to cut your fabric. So you can see now we're left with just our fabric. Now you can see how we have aligned that seam. So I've pinned my base to my embroidered section. I'm using the stitching line that we did originally as my guide, and I'm sewing with the free arm. So I've taken my embroidery unit off, or if you're using the sewing section, take that off. It's much easier for this to run through when you've got that as a free arm. Now I'm very carefully removing my pins as I work my round, and I've got that stitching line as my guide. And this one is quite stiff, so you'll see it does stand up a bit. If you don't do those nicks, it is extremely difficult to sew this down. So just take your time and work around following the stitching line as your guide. Once the sides have been attached to the base, nick into the base with little wedges so that it makes it easier to turn to the right side. So we now have our base attached to our embroidered surface and turned to the right side and pressed. we need to do exactly the same with the lining. So I'm going to sew again on my stitching line to attach the embroidered centre piece to the lining. So now the inside base and the lining for the sides are attached, and as before I've nicked the little triangles out of the base circle so that it'll sit nicely inside the trim bin. Once your lining is complete, turn to the wrong side and pin wrong side to wrong side the outer part of the bin to the lining. Once we've pinned the lining to the outer part of our trim bin, we need to sew those together before we add our binding. So I sew just inside a 1/4 inch seam, sew those two together. Now we've got our lining and our outer trim bin attached, we have to add the binding. So I've used my binding clips and I've left an opening of at least 6 inches so that I can then join my binding on the bias and attach it. So the opening I've actually left is at the back of the bin where we have that seam. And I'm going to stitch on the inside a 1/4 inch and then join, turn to the outside, and as you can see on this one, I've top stitched close to the edge so that we've got a nice strong edge to our trim bin. So I've used the stitching line as my guide and I've stitched my binding to the inside edge, leaving that opening as I spoke about before. Now what we need to do is join our binding. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut a piece off the longer side and open it out so that I can measure this properly. And I'm going to use my clips again just to hold it in place. Because we're on a curved surface, it's not like a flat quilt that we're doing. So we need to make sure that this is close to the edge like you would normally on a flat surface. So once I've come to this section here, I need to cut the overlap. I'm going to fold where the two join together because that's my guide. And now from that point, from that fold line, I need to add the width of the opened out piece of binding. And I trim that off. And what that does is gives us the exact measurement to create a mitered join on our binding. So I open my two pieces out and pin together. Need to open my pins. So I pin along the straight edges first, here and along the top. And we're going to stitch diagonally from that point to that point there. Now you can rule that if you wish, or you can freehand it. What I tend to do is put pins on the diagonal straight across from that point and use that as my sewing guide. And the other thing I do to help me sew is I pull that together and I hold it together with my binding clips, and that makes it easier to get a nice flat area to stitch that diagonal. So we've stitched across the diagonal, and we can just check by folding it in half and making sure that it's going to fit perfectly, and it does. Once we've done that, we can trim our seam back to roughly 1/4 inch seam. And then I always finger press this open because it will give you a flatter join to your binding. Once you've got that complete, use your binding clips again and finish stitching that seam. So I've got the binding attached. We've joined our binding on the diagonal, as you can see, and so it gives a perfect seam all the way around. What I've done next is press my binding outward, so you can see on the front that's how it looks. And what we're going to do now is fold this over until it just touches the half circle edge. And then I will use my binding clips to hold it in place. So all the way around with the binding clips. I now need to sew my binding to the outside edge of our trim bin. And one of the things that I've purchased as an extra for my machine is a sewing star foot. And the reason for doing that is it gives me a little guide here. Now on my stitch, I've selected my straight stitch and I have moved my needle position to 1.5, which moves my needle just to the right. And I can use this as a guide now and have my stitching just outside the edge of the folded edge of the binding. So I've stitched the binding to the outer edge and our lovely trim bin is finished. And you can see here how lovely it looks in the two different colourways and how very useful they are, because while I was making this one was by my machine catching all my trims, and that's why I call it my trim bin.